Okay, everyone. So you're now recorded, so don't say anything too mean.
Okay, should we go ahead and get started?
Cool. Yeah. So welcome everyone to Adam Caccavale, the Thesis defense. I'm very excited to share this defense in person for the first time ever. Okay, cool. So Matt, maybe you want to say something?
Yeah, great. I'll say some things. Yeah, thanks, Jenna. We're all still used to trying to get used to the physical world instead of the virtual world. Yeah, so it's a really a pleasure for me to introduce Adam. You all know Adam, I think, very well by now. So he was one of the, I would say, early members of the MSL after we started here at Stanford. Adam, as you'll see, has done some an interesting evolution of work around robot perception, various problems in robot perception. He started back in 2015 at Stanford, and then that was at the same time that I started at Stanford, actually, and was involved in a few of my first classes the first year. So I apologize, Adam, for you having to test drive my first iterations of my classes. But then he got involved in some research over the summer, which was pretty successful, and you might see a little bit of that in the talk today. And then he became a member of the MSL in 2016. Adam, before that, did his bachelor's degree at Duke, and then worked as a professional engineer for a few years before deciding to come out here. So Adam's been a pleasure. Adam's more than just a researcher in the lab. I think you all would agree that he's been a great organizer and a great facilitator and helping with building a lot of the infrastructure that makes the MSL what it is. And he's contributed to a lot of really nice group projects. And I think that one interesting facet of his work that you'll see, which is that when we started his PhD, we were really hot on the idea of highly resource constrained robots, because of course at that time we thought of robots as being these very meager things that needed to do a lot with a little. And then his PhD, I'd say, corresponded with more or less the deep learning revolution. And by the end of his PhD, we decided, forget resource constrained. We really embraced the kind of big data, big computing concepts of deep learning. And so you'll see there's some interesting extremes of the spectrum in this research. So Adam, take the floor, please.
Thank you very much. All right, so I'm going to start my talk now. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and for everyone who joined on Zoom. Today, I'm going to talk to you about my research, multi-agent mapping and tracking with novel environment representations. Shown here are a few different scenarios in which it's useful to use robots. This ranges from disaster relief, self-driving cars, Mars exploration, and package delivery. Something that all of these have in common is that the robot needs situational awareness. And by that, I mean they need to understand their environment, where they are in it, and where obstacles are relative to themselves. In order to do this, they need some way of being able to represent the obstacle or the map. Now, there's many different ways to do this, but the choice of how they do this is oftentimes kind of overlooked. It's oftentimes the ways in which it's chosen is just whatever's convenient based on the sensor. So just to get concrete about what I mean by this representation, I mean a data structure that the robot uses to accumulate data over time and combine it, and hopefully this reflects the truth of the world around it. And just to give an example of this, you might have a robot that wants to map a room with a LiDAR sensor. A LiDAR shoots lasers out at different angles and times how long it takes for them to bounce back to get the distances. So if you imagine looking at the room from the top down and overlaying the world with a grid, as the robot gets these distance measurements at different angles, it could color in the grids or mark each one, yes, occupied, or no, empty. This is known as an occupancy grid, as is shown here. Now, this seems like a very intuitive and useful way to create a map. But if you rely on this, you might find that if you go to try and map out a much larger area, the memory cost of this map is going to be huge. And even if the single robot can handle it, well, what if you have multiple robots that want to work together and they want to share what they've learned? So now all of a sudden you're sending this really memory intensive map between robots, and that's going to slow things down. This gets even worse when we move to 3 dimensions. So instead of a square, there's a cube, and that is called voxels and is shown by this first rabbit model. A different representation than kind of this occupancy grid voxel method is called a point cloud. So this is a collection of points in 3D space, so like X, Y, Z locations. And a common sensor that generates this is a depth camera. You're probably familiar with the camera, and a depth camera is kind of a cross between a camera and a LiDAR. So at each pixel, you get the color, but you also get the distance to the surface of the object. With this point cloud representation, it's very convenient to quickly to build up iterative measurements because you can basically just overlay the point clouds, which is just appending to this list of X, Y, Z points. However, this representation is pretty difficult for a robot to make use of because as a human, you can look at this and be like, I know that's a rabbit, and like because you have context. Robots, on the other hand, it can be difficult to know where the surface of the object is, and if you have a whole environment represented by this, it's not always clear what area the robot can get through. This can be processed into a 3D mesh, which is shown here as the third representation, or the third rabbit. This solves some of those problems that the point cloud has because each point knows what its neighbors are, and so there's some knowledge of the surface. However, this is a difficult structure to kind of update iteratively, and so it has its own downsides. So these are just some of the common ones that are used nowadays. And in contrast, in this work, I'm going to be talking about more unique representations as shown here on the right. So these are going to span from a high-level map representation all the way down to a very photorealistic, detailed object representation. And in each work, I'm going to emphasize how the unique aspects of this representation can be leveraged to enable the algorithm to work better. And by the algorithm, I mean specifically the task the robot is seeking to do. And so in my work, that's mostly going to be mapping and tracking. In mapping, the robot wants to kind of understand the environment around it at a large scale, and generally is trying to map out a static environment. Tracking, on the flip side, is the robot wants to understand where obstacles are in its local area, and these might be smaller and more dynamic, and it wants to know where these are relative to it. And these are complementary methods because the map can be used to plan a path. Meanwhile, understanding where objects are around the robots can be used to avoid running into things. Both of these are kind of a fundamental capability for a lot of more complex robotic systems. If you have a robot vacuum cleaner, it might need to build a map so it can measure where it's already, so it can know where it's already cleaned and where it still has to clean. And it can use onboard sensing to avoid, say, running over your dog. But both of these mapping and tracking methods kind of at the core boil down to a very similar kind of data cycle, at least the ones I'll be talking about today. The robot has some belief about the world, and based on that, it's going to make a prediction. Using its onboard sensors, it's going to take some measurements and compare what it sees to what it expected to see. And based on that difference, it's going to update its belief. And by doing this over and over again, we hope that the robot's representation is going to converge to accurately represent the real world. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I dive into the details of my work is multi-robot systems. So I am in the MSL, or Multi-Robot Systems Lab, and there's several advantages to using multiple robots. The first, and is probably the most obvious, is the fact that if you have a large area and you want to map, having multiple robots map all at the same time, well, you can do things faster. Additionally, multi-robot systems have a kind of inherent robustness to them. In that mapping example, if a robot breaks down, well, maybe the other robots can keep going and finish the task. Now, if you're NASA and you can only send one rover to Mars and that rover falls in a crater, you're out of luck. So now, shown here, I mentioned specifically distributed multi-robot systems. And so this is what I use. And distributed means each robot is going to be making its own decisions based on its own data, independent of the other robots. In contrast, a centralized system has a single robot or computer that's telling everyone what to do. In this centralized system, well, it's a lot easier to coordinate, but now you've introduced a single point of failure and also a limit on perhaps the number of robots you can use to achieve what you want. Because if you keep adding more robots, you're going to hit a limit on what that single computer can do. Distributed systems, on the other hand, are able to scale to any number of robots. So this slide shows the 4 chapters of my thesis. The first is wireframe mapping. Here I'll introduce a novel sparse map representation. So this is going to scale very well with map size, and you can think of it as kind of the opposite of the occupancy grid I talked about before. Along with the map representation, I'm also going to talk about this framework for a group of robots to create this map in a distributed manner. The next chapter of my thesis focuses on another memory-efficient map representation called topological mapping. Now, this type of map is actually, it's kind of abstract. So instead of your typical map that measures kind of distances between objects and walls and that sort of thing, a topological map is going to capture kind of connections in the environment. So as an example, if you had a floor in a building with a bunch of different rooms, you might be able to enter one room from another, and this kind of like which rooms can be move between, or which rooms you can move between, is a sort of kind of abstract connections that can be captured by this map representation. This is also a distributed mapping framework, so you can use any number of robots to kind of understand this sort of structure in the environment. The third chapter of my thesis is now shifting gears from this kind of these lightweight mapping algorithms to a object tracker. However, we're going to keep with the same lightweight theme here because, but unlike before where the map representation was lightweight, our goal here is we want to be able to run our algorithm on board the hardware that is on our lab, on our drones that we have in lab. And so we need the algorithm to be able to be run very quickly. And we achieve this in part because we represent the robot just with a handful of points, as little as 3 dimensions, the length, width, and height, which give you the 3D bounded dots. Now, finally, in my last work is NERF visual odometry. This project is also going to be concerned with understanding where objects are relative to the robot, but at the same time, the robot is going to be estimating its path through the environment. So it's going to be calculating both of those things at the same time. It will do this using a representation called a NERF, which is a type of neural network that has become really popular recently for its ability to encode the geometry and color of objects and be able to recreate them or render them in high detail. So you can make photorealistic images of this object or scene from new views. And I'm going to talk about all of this more later. Due to time constraints today, I'm not going to be able to get into the details of topological mapping, but all the details can be found in my thesis, and if you have questions, you can ask me about it later. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about wireframe mapping. So as I mentioned before, this is both a map representation and a corresponding framework that allows a group of robots to construct this map of the environment. This is going to include how they can update the map, how they can explore the area, and also how when they come into communication range with one another, they can share what they've learned so far. This video shows a robot moving through an environment building one of these wireframe maps. And so the first thing you might notice is that all the environment is being represented by a collection of straight lines. So this is one of the assumptions we're making in order to achieve this extreme memory efficiency. Now you might wonder, like, well, what happens if you have an environment that's not well represented by this? So in that case, you could perhaps use a different sort of geometric primitive like a spline, but that's beyond the scope of the work here. So we're going to assume we're mapping out, like, say, a man-made structure, which are generally well represented by these rectilinear maps. So the wireframe itself is a labeled, embedded, directed graph, which is a lot of adjectives, and I'm going to explain what that means now. Mathematically, a graph is simply a collection of vertices and edges that connect these things. So in the wireframe, these vertices are going to correspond to corners in the environment, and the edges, in this case directed edges, are going to represent walls between the corners. Now, it's an embedded graph because each of these corners are embedded in R2, meaning there's an actual physical location, so an XY coordinate associated with each. In addition to the embedding, each label also, or each vertex also has a label. This is going to be either nominal, occlusion, or frontier. A nominal corner is simply a point that has 2 edges coming out of it. And in a completed map, all points are going to be nominal points. However, it was useful to label some points in a different manner as the map is being constructed. So as you'll notice here, this one obstacle is blocking the robot's view of the back edge. So the end point of this occluding edge is called an occlusion point, and its projection onto the back edge is called a frontier point. We call it a frontier point because what it is capturing is the fact that we've only seen part of the edge and that there's more here to discover. This is going to form the basis of our exploration algorithm, which I'll describe later. So the core of how the robot is going to be updating its map is using a structure or a framework called a particle filter. This is going to get a little abstract if you're not familiar with Bayesian filtering, but at a high level, this is going to follow that same pattern where the robot is going to make a prediction, compare that to its measurement, and then update its belief based on that. So in a particle filter, generally you're trying to estimate a probability distribution. And the way you're doing that is with a set of particles. Each one you propagate with the dynamics, you adjust their likelihood based on how well these match your measurements, and then you resample keeping the likeliest particles. Now, how do we actually use this for our wireframe map? Well, we actually do it in a pretty unique way. So here, each of our particles is an entire map. So you can think of these particles almost as a map hypothesis. So one particle might have an edge that doesn't exist in another, or the location of these corners could be different. As the robot then continues to take future measurements, the likelihood of each of these maps or particles is going to be adjusted. And in this manner, we're able to both keep the most likely map at any given time while still considering other options, and also remove individual edges. This is shown in practice in this video here. As the robot moves through the environment, you can see the map being constructed. And the transparency of the line corresponds to kind of how likely the robot thinks that edge is that it exists. Now, one thing I want to point out is when the robot is going to turn this corner, you'll notice that the information in the top left disappeared. And so this indicates that the robot had a mismatch between what it expected to see versus what it actually saw. And this is because this video is before we incorporated these directed edges and serves as a great example of why we're using them. So if you imagine you were just in a room and you were looking at the wallpaper, and then you walked through the door and turned around, you wouldn't actually expect to see the backside of the wallpaper. However, that's what these slightly dumb robots are doing. So using the edge direction, there'll be a mismatch in direction when you're predicting that you're going to see the backside of a wall versus what you actually measure. And by identifying this, you can simply not penalize that edge, and that will take care of these situations. Another situation that's very similar that's super useful is when you're combining two maps. At first glance, this dark blue map looks like a very reasonable merge of these two path maps. But you'll notice that this tall vertical edge has been collapsed to a single line. While this looks reasonable when you're using bidirectional edges, if you have directed edges, it's easy to identify this and reject this merge. I'll talk more about how merging is done later, but I just wanted to highlight another situation in which these directed edges are useful. So beyond the directed edges, I mentioned that the point labels are going to form the basis of the exploration algorithm. So here, a simple but very effective way for a robot to move through the environment is simply to chase the closest frontier point. With a limited communication or sensing range, the frontier point might be, say, at the edge of what it sees. It'll take a step forward, see a little more of that line, which will push that frontier point out. So you can think of it as a carrot on a stick that draws the robot into unexplored areas of the map. Eventually, then there will be no more frontier points, at which point it can change to a different mode of exploration. Now I'm going to talk about how these robots actually work together. So I mentioned before that this is a distributed system, which means we want to make as few as possible assumptions about what the robots share in terms of what they know. So we don't assume that they have a common coordinate frame or origin. And so the first task when robots walk into communication range with one another is that they need to align their map information before it could be merged. Now, this is where we run into one of the downsides of having this really sparse map representation. The details that are pretty memory intensive in other representations could be useful for kind of identifying, is this a good map alignment or not? However, we're able to get around this by taking inspiration from the computer vision field and defining a feature vector for each vertex in the map. This is defined based on the graphical structure. So we look at the relative distances and angles of the two hop neighbors. And then when used in the ransack framework, we're able to come up with a proposed map alignment. I don't have time to talk about ransack in detail, but it's more or less a fancy trial and error that does it in kind of a probabilistically rigorous way. Now, just because it's the best alignment you've found so far doesn't mean it's the right alignment. And you can imagine if you tried to merge in like misaligned maps, you would end up having a whole lot of bad edges that you're going to have to correct down the line. So in order to avoid this, we introduced a verification stage before the merged information is accepted. So when two robots come within a range, they will send their information, which includes both their map and their location inside that map. So with a proposed alignment, the receiving robot can try and navigate to that location of the other robot. And along the way, we'll keep scanning and do that comparison between what it expects to see versus what it actually sees. And based on that, it can either reject the entire merge or decide, yes, I'm going to accept this. This can save a lot of work down the line. So in order to evaluate our method, we did wireframe mapping in simulation in both MATLAB, and eventually we moved to Gazebo for the more accurate error modeling for the LiDAR sensor that we're using. The first way we evaluated the map is we compared to a very common 2D mapping baseline called G-mapping. This is a Raoult Blackwellized particle filter method for creating an occupancy grid. But in order to actually compare how a wireframe map compares to this other method, we had to make some decisions so we'd be competing on equal footing. The first is with an occupancy grid, you need to choose the size of the squares because that affects the resolution it's able to capture. So we chose a grid size that was equal to the threshold at which we would merge two wireframe corners into a single one. Then we chose a map size so that the overall memory footprint of this particular occupancy grid matched that of the wireframe. So it's a fairly small environment. But this way now they're on equal footing, and at this equal comparison, we were able to significantly outperform the other method in terms of accuracy. But this isn't really the kind of the situation in which you would use wireframe mapping. You want to test it on kind of a much bigger environment. This shows a floor plan of the Natural History Museum for one of the levels, and is about 200 by 200 meters. The red shows the measured wireframe map overlaid the black ground truth. And you can see it's pretty accurate, just kind of visually speaking, though there are some corners that are cut. But despite that, this would be a perfectly usable map if you wanted to give it to a robot to say, okay, now you can plan a path from one section to another, and then you just use your onboard obstacle avoidance to avoid actually running into things. Another way we evaluated this map, and this is important when you ever have a multi-robot system, is does it actually work better with multiple robots? So we ran our experiment with multiple numbers of robots at different communication ranges, each one multiple times. And this graph here shows the average number of iterations it took to complete the map. As expected and hoped for, this decreases, though for a given map size eventually it saturates because adding a new robot, there's just, it doesn't really add that much more because the robots are practically on top of each other. So in conclusion, wireframe mapping is a memory efficient map representation, and it goes along with this framework to enable a distributed group of robots to explore and map an environment. So at this point, I'm going to skip over the other mapping method, topological mapping, and start talking about MSL-RAPTOR. So this, again, is a framework for tracking an object relative to the camera. But again, our main goal here was we wanted to run the algorithm on the robot. So similar, we kind of had this like lightweight theme, but it's kind of done in a different way. Here, the representation is lightweight, so it's enabled to require minimal processing power. And I'll talk about how that's used in a second. So this video shows the view from a drone that's flying in the flight room, tracking another drone in the same flight room. So MSL-RAPTOR is an acronym. It stands for Monocular Sequential Lightweight Rotation and Position Tracking on Robots. And I apologize for the slightly tortured acronym, but we really like getting MSL, our lab title, in, plus the imagery evoked by Raptor. This is a little bit of a bird of prey feel for one drone tracking another. So the way this algorithm works is it's going to take in a sequence of monocular images or a video feed, and based on this 2D information, it is going to estimate the 3D pose of the object or objects in the environment. And this picture at the bottom of the screen shows the drone that we use. So this is one of the drones in lab, and it is augmented with both a camera and an NVIDIA TX2 chip for computation. So this chip has a small GPU, which is important because a part of our framework is going to include using neural networks. And so this can make that a lot faster. And so the object representation used for MSL-RAPTOR, I mentioned, could be as little as just knowing the length, width, and height of the object you're looking to track. However, there is some flexibility built into this framework. So if you have more information, you can use it. And you can imagine an open laptop isn't really well represented by a 3D bounding box because there's a lot of kind of empty space there. But by adding just a few more points, you can much more tightly kind of capture the shape of the object, which helps improve tracking. Now you can take this to extreme and eventually have a huge dense point cloud of the object, but eventually that is defeating the purpose of this lightweight algorithm. So at a high level, we're going to get monocular images, or just images, that are going to be processed into 3D poses. But the way we decided to approach this was, we wanted to use Bayesian filtering as the backend because it is very good at kind of taking kind of this partial information and iteratively updating a state that couldn't be figured out from just one measurement by itself. And furthermore, gives us a rigorous uncertainty measurement. And this ends up being really nice because we can take advantage of it by passing it back to the front end, which is and by front end, I mean the part of the pipeline that is going to be processing the image. I'm going to explain all this in more detail shortly, but at a high level, an image comes in, is processed into a 2D bounding box. This is sent to the back end, which then estimates the 3D pose and uncertainty, and that uncertainty is sent back to the front end. So the front end is actually made up of two different networks together, working together. And the reason for this, again, goes back to our desire for speed. So an object detector is probably one of the most common types of neural networks. And given an image, it's able to identify objects in it and draw a bounding box around them and say what class they are. So in this image here, it finds a dog, a bicycle, and a truck. Now, because the nature of this algorithm this network has to kind of examine the full image, it can be a little slower compared to a different type of network, which unfortunately, kind of confusingly, is also called a tracker. This tracker network says, given a bounding box and the corresponding image, and the next image in the sequence, how does that bounding box shift? So given a series of images, assuming it's been initialized, it can track how the bounding box is moving frame to frame, and it can do it faster than this detector. So because of these kind of complementary capabilities, we can use the object detector to initialize the tracker, which can then run faster. However, the tracker, because it's only using local information around that bounding box, it cannot recover if it loses the object, which is going to be shown in this video here. Green bounding boxes are the output of the object tracker, and you'll see periodically it turns red, which means we reset it by using the object detector. We can trigger this when that uncertainty metric that was passed from the backend spikes, indicating that we've kind of lost track of the object, that our measurements are not matching where we expect it to be. And so in that manner, it is able to recover when the quad flew in front of the door and the tracker kind of lost it for a second. And this way we can have a front end that's kind of a robust system by itself. All right, so now I'm going to talk about how the backend works and the core idea here. Familiar, or like yet again, you're going to see this kind of predict, measure, update cycle in action here. But because our measurements or output of the front end is going to be a 2D bounding box, we need a way to predict what 2D bounding box we're going to see. Given the 3D pose of the object and the way we're representing it, which is again some subset of points, we're able to project those points onto the image plane and draw the 2D bounding box around that. Then we can compare that against the actual measured bounding box and use that to update this 3D pose. However, it's important to realize that there's multiple 3D poses that can give you that same 2D information. So this is why it's really important that we have a sequence of images, because just from a single measurement, we're not able to uniquely define what the pose of the object is. Something we did that didn't fully solve the problem, but did help, is the fact that we actually use angled bounding boxes as opposed to the more common axis-aligned bounding boxes. This more tightly fits the object shown in this image here, and this reduces kind of the space of poses that would give you the same 2D measurement. All right, so this is kind of a high-level look at what the backend is doing. So I mentioned how these angled 2D bounding boxes are sent in, and then we use Bayesian filtering, in this case, an unscented Kalman filter, or UKF, to actually estimate the pose and uncertainty of the object. If you have multiple objects, you can spin up a UKF to track each one. So this wasn't actually done in our published paper. It's something that the framework can handle. And the really only thing you would need to add is some way to solve the correspondence problem when you run your object detector, so you know which instance of this class bounding box corresponds to which object. So you could do that with something like the Hungarian algorithm. So one thing I want to mention about this UKF, though, as part of its predict step, it uses a dynamics model. And now, if you don't know anything about what you're tracking, you kind of just have to assume it's going to be still, and any difference between any motion it actually has is going to just be compensated for by the natural error correction of the UKF. However, because we get a class label as part of our object detector, you can use a class-based dynamics model. And so if we see it's a car versus a drone, you can use a more accurate model, and that can help the tracker improve its performance. Additionally, if you are, say, tracking an object that has inherent symmetry in it, and you can tell that based on the class, well, then you can use that to reduce the state that you're estimating with that UKF. So for example, if you're just estimating a soda can that's symmetric about the vertical axis, there's no real reason to estimate the yaw angle here. And in general, a smaller state space is just easier for these filters to track. So the very first way we evaluated this method was on a data set known as NOx. We compared it against, at the time, the state-of-the-art methods in pose estimation. And we were a little disappointed to find just about every method required depth, so RGB-D data. Despite that, we were able to perform on par or better on this data set, which gave us a huge boost of confidence in our method. But the real question we wanted to answer was, could we run this on board our drone, and how would it compare against the next best method on the same footing? So this is showing the performance on our drone, and the only other method we could find that was even remotely capable of performing on par with us on this limited hardware was single shot pose, or SSP. This method took in kind of these similar assumptions. So it assumed it knew the bounding box size of the object. And it was a neural network that would directly output the 2D projections of the object's 3D bounding boxes. Then, using a PNP algorithm, the pose of the object could be calculated. So despite the fact that this was billed as one of the faster methods, it was only able to run about 3 Hertz when we got closer to 9. So we were able to be about 3 times faster and perform much more accurately, as shown by these plots on the right. These are cumulative error distributions, so you can interpret them by looking at the x-axis as kind of an error threshold, and the y value being kind of what percentage of measurements fall within this threshold. So as the x-axis goes to infinity, all these curves are going to eventually approach 100, but MSL-RAPTOR is able to approach it much faster. I do want to point out that in our data set of trying to track this drone, we were tracking it as far as like 8 meters away, which is a pretty challenging task for an object that's moving pretty quickly. One thing that I forgot to mention before is in this experiment, we are running odometry, very accurate odometry on board the Ego robot. So we're only trying to estimate where the other object is at each time, even though both are in motion. This is going to be different than the next method I talk about. But in conclusion, MSL-RAPTOR was a success. We were able to run it on board our robot, and we're able to take advantage of kind of the benefits offered by deep learning and those offered by Bayesian filtering and combine into a robust algorithm. Very little data is needed to track a new object. Basically, all you need to do is have an object detector that can find that object, which is pretty common. And if not, it's pretty easy to train. In addition to that, you just need to know the size of the tracked object. Lastly, we were able to, I was very excited by the fact that we were able to take advantage of kind of this like class-specific label in order to improve the performance of the tracker. Like this was kind of something we didn't plan on originally, but we realized as we were doing it, and it was kind of a nice bonus. All right, so at this point, I've talked about wireframe mapping, which is a way for robots to create this big sparse map. Then I talked about MSL-RAPTOR, which was a way for us to use our lab, drones from lab to track other objects in its vicinity. Now I'm going to talk about NERF visual odometry, which again is trying to localize objects in its environment, but also at the same time estimate its path through that same environment. So to begin with, I'm going to define what a NERF is. A NERF is a neural radiance field, and it's a type of neural network. So this network is able to encode the geometry and color of an object. So you can query it at different points and get a density and a color. The density is related technically to the probability of a ray of light being stopped, but in practice, if it's not a transparent object, you can use that as a stand-in for kind of volume. This video on the right looks like it was just taken with a camera. It's really impressive, but it's in fact actually an output of one of these networks. And that's why people really like them, is that you can generate these really photorealistic images. So the way you will generate an image is assuming you have a scene, in this case Stonehenge, represented by a NERF, and you have a position and a direction from which you want to generate the image, shown here is this camera. You can trace a ray from the camera's origin through a pixel, and at different points along the ray, you can query this radiant, basically the density and the color. By combining all the values along the ray in a way known as alpha blending, you can get the value for that pixel. Doing it for each pixel in your image will give you that full image. Now, there's one last benefit of this network I want to mention, which is because it is a neural network, it is differentiable. And what that means is we can tell kind of how a shift in the input and a shift in the output are related, or basically you can back propagate a change in the output or a difference in the output through the network to update the input. And this is going to be important for how we're able to update our drone or our drone's location and object positions. But before I get into my method, I do want to just define the general high-level problem of visual odometry. So this is a classic robotics problem and usually deals with, given two images that are of the same scene, you want to know how the camera has moved between it based on kind of commonalities. Most typically, you'll scan the image for kind of unique feature points, and you'll try and find which points correspond to the same points in the other image. And based on how these have moved and geometry, you're able to estimate how the camera has moved. If you do this again and again and again, you can estimate how the camera that's on the robot has moved through the environment. And there's other things you can do, such as kind of a batch optimization over the previous frames to refine it. But at a high level, this is what is going on. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before I dive into my method is the previous work that served as our inspiration. So this is a paper that I was a co-author on called Vision-Only Robot Navigation in a Neural Radiance World. So this is also a paper that deals with NERFs. Here, the goal was for the robot to plan and execute a trajectory through a world that was represented by a single NERF. But there's one kind of subcomponent of this that I want to focus on specifically, which is how in this method with an environment as a NERF, the robot was able to say, given my image, how can I correct my assumption about where I am in the world? So shown here in transparent is the true position of the drone, and above it is the believed, where the drone thinks it is. On the right in this box, there's an overlay of a transparent, the real image that it gets, which is based from where it is, overlaid with what it predicts, which is based on the incorrect pose. Now, based on the mismatch of these images, the robot is able to update its position, and you'll see as it approaches the true position, the overlaid images kind of appear to come into focus as the prediction starts to match the actual measurement. This is a little different than the previous two ways, but it's still kind of that same predict, measure, update cycle that has been throughout this entire presentation. So to summarize, this previous work used a single NERF of the environment and was estimating just a single camera pose at each time. Now, what I'm going to do in my method is estimate multiple camera poses at multiple, or like at one time, along with each individual object pose. And instead of just having a single NERF of the environment, I'll have a NERF for each object. And so in this scene, there's a plant, a table, and a chair. I assume our drone has a camera on it and is going to be moving through the environment, and it has some manner of performing odometry. Perhaps it's integrating an IMU to give a noisy estimate of how it's moved. So each of these drones shown here is the same drone, just at different time steps. So it starts here looking at the scene from behind the chair and kind of circles it to look from behind. Similar to MSL-RAPTOR, the drone is going to be using an object detector to know what it's actually looking at in a given view. And it has some manner of initializing that pose estimate. The biggest assumption, though, that we're making is the fact that we have a pre-trained NERF model for each of the objects in the scene. And this is a pretty big assumption, but I'll talk later about how future work can soften this. So what am I actually going to be doing? So I mentioned before how I'm going to be optimizing multiple views at a given time along with the object poses. But if I always did all of the robot views, well, that trajectory is going to continue to grow as the robot moves. And eventually the number of things I'm trying to estimate would be too big. So instead, I use what's called a sliding window approach, where I fix a set number of views and I'll optimize those together along with the object poses. So first, that's views 1, 2, and 3. Then 2, 3, and 4, then 4, 5, and 6, and so on and so on. And you can see on the side, these are what the robot is seeing from each of these corresponding views. So now a very common thing is or a very natural expectation is if you're estimating multiple objects in a single camera image, you will get multiple relative poses, one for each object from that view. But if I have multiple views and I do this, plus I have connections between each camera view, all those different connections I just mentioned is going to look like this kind of tangled mess. Because there are cycles in this object, which is called the pose graph, that means because these connections are noisy, you actually need a second level of optimization known as pose graph optimization. However, I can avoid all of this and estimate fewer variables by always using a minimal pose graph for each of the windows in the sliding window framework. And so by that, all my poses are always just relative to the first camera view. So these images here show the first 6 of the camera views. And right now you see both the measurement in transparent plus the robot's prediction of what it's going to see in solid. And so you can see right now, initially, there's a mismatch. As the sliding window progresses, you'll see the first 3 frames be optimized, they'll turn white. And this kind of mismatch between the prediction and the measured will correct. This window will increment and continue to increment. And once the view turns gray again, that means it's kind of out of range of the sliding window. So there's no longer optimization being done on that camera poses. But if the object is appearing in the new views, that position will still be optimized as well. So as you can see now at the end, all of these kind of what previously mismatched between the initial estimate and the measurement are now all aligned. Quantitatively, this is what the error looks like. So as expected, both the translation and rotation error decreased. Otherwise, we wouldn't see those views converge. But one very interesting thing that I didn't expect originally was the fact that if you break out like the error by object and camera means keyframe here, and break that down into rotation and translation, you'll notice that the camera translation is corrected a lot less than these other values. And at first I was confused by that until I remembered the way in which we are optimizing this system is based on the photometric loss, or the difference between what we render versus what we expect to see. And if a camera is far away from an object and you rotate that camera, there's going to be a really big difference in between the predicted and measured photos. However, if you just translate the robot the camera a couple millimeters, there's not going to be that big of a difference, and that explains why this happens. But overall, the error does decrease a fair amount. And again, one of the big goals of our method is to kind of understand the scene. So we're most interested actually in the objects, and that error, both the translation and rotation, decreased significantly. So in conclusion, NERF VO, or NERF Visual Odometry, is able to jointly optimize both the objects and the poses, and the robot poses. And at this moment, or at this point, I want to kind of talk more about the differentiability of the network and things that opens up for the future. So I mentioned one of the assumptions we're making is we have a specific NERF trained for each object, which is a pretty big limitation. It would be a lot better if we could say have a category level NERF. So we have a NERF train that represents mugs, and one that does tables, another that does chairs. And then at the same time that we're optimizing the pose location, we're also optimizing the network weights to adapt to kind of fit the object we're actually looking at. To be clear, this is something that's left right now for future work, but there is current research right now being done into kind of these meta NERFs. So it is conceivable that this would work well. Additionally, another thing you might want to estimate in order to improve the tracking would be the light source and intensity. So because we're using visual information for this optimization, and things look very different when it's in a bright light or in the shadow, especially if you're running this outside, it would be really nice if you could have a system that, or a NERF that could adjust based on what you think the light source is. And so there is work done right now where NERFs let you kind of after training adjust this. And so if you could use this type of NERF along with estimate where the light source is, you could potentially track a lot better as the object moves, say, between shadows and light. Lastly, I want to talk about differentiable simulation. So this is work that's currently being done in our lab right now. And this, kind of in the same way that our representation as a NERF is differentiable, this allows you to, based on what you observe about how objects interact, to update your estimates of things like the mass and inertial properties. And so a NERF would be a natural fit into this sort of framework. Sorry.
Your computers.
Yeah. But yeah, so anyways, these will be a natural fit together, and that's an area of active research in our lab now. And so just to wrap up everything I've talked about today so far, I started with wireframe mapping, which was a novel sparse map representation, along with a distributed framework for creating this map. I skipped topological mapping and went into MSL-RAPTOR, which enabled our hardware in lab to be able to track other objects in the scene. And lastly, I talked about NERF VO, which is this object-oriented visual odometry method that, that produces an output where you can then render the scene in photorealistic detail. Shown here are a list of my publications. The NERF VO work is still in preparation right now, but hopefully we'll be able to submit that not too long. And I'd like to give a big thanks to everyone who came today, and especially my committee. And Mac in particular, thank you so much for your help throughout this PhD process. We had a couple false starts in the beginning with like oppressive sensing, and you helped me kind of navigate the kind of research landscape and find something that I both am really interested in and I think I'm good at. So I really appreciate that. And yeah, thank you, Jeanette, for agreeing to be my chair. I know it was a little last minute, but yeah. Just thank you also to the rest of my committee, especially in advance for having to read my thesis. I also want to acknowledge the two people I've been collaborating with. Benjamin was a co-author on MSL-RAPTOR, and Tim is working with me right now on the NERF VO stuff. You guys both have both helped make the research better, but you also made the whole process just so much more fun. So thank you very much. I also want to acknowledge the MSL as a whole. Research can be a little stressful in grad school. You guys were a great outlet for this stress, as both just being silly, but also for helping when I get stuck on a research problem, I can always turn to you guys for help. I also want to thank my friends and family, like your love and support through this whole process. Like without that, I would not have made it to where I am now, and I really, really appreciate it. And a special shout out to Doris, my girlfriend. The best times over these past several years has been our adventures together, from the caves in Vietnam to beaches in Mexico. And I look forward to our future adventures up in Seattle. Thank you very much, everyone. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
Sure, I can try. I mean, you will probably see them maybe first in this room. Are there any questions?
bear with me because I'm not in this skill at all. So
No, that's fine.
It's either going to be really easy questions or nobody knows the answer. So the first, I actually have a question on each of the three parts, which so the first question was, you talked about how this, you said something about how the different drones in a scenario each have their own origin point type, and like they may be different, but how does each individual drone determine what its origin point is? Is it just the first?
Exactly. It just says, I'm going to start, I'm going to call this 0, 0. The way I'm facing is up. And then, but every drone starts facing a different way at a different spot. So they're all different.
Okay. Next question is in terms of the angled bounding boxes, and you're talking about the free space within them. You might have answered this while I was writing the question down, but do you use how much free space is within that box as any sort of like uncertainty or gauge of below object's position is being?
So we don't. So we don't actually know anything about. So well, let me start over. I guess we get an image, and then the neural network just gives us the 2D bounding box. So we don't actually know anything about how much empty space is in there. If we used a more advanced neural network, like an image segmenter that gives you kind of a pixel by pixel label, you potentially could do something like that. But that is not what we're using because, again, we're limited by networks that could go fast enough for our application.
Okay. And then my last question, sorry, is so when you're talking about the NERF object identification, can you make use of object identifying software that already exists like Google Lens and incorporate that in?
So yeah, so I'm actually using a system called Detectron 2, which is produced by Facebook. In the MSL-RAPTOR stuff, I was actually making use of a version of YOLO, which again was other previous research. So both of these are kind of like frameworks, and so you can insert whatever method you want as long as it gives you the output you need. So in the first case, it just needs to give a bounding box, and for the NERF VO, I don't even use the bounding box right now, though you could depending on how you're initializing the objects. In this case, I just need to know what objects are in view so I can optimize those ones only, because that way I'm not trying to adjust the position of something that I'm not even looking at. Thank you.
Great. Are there other questions in this critical group?
Hey, Adam, this is Carl. Can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, great presentation, by the way. I think it was really, you did a good job explaining to us lay people who may not really know too much about this, but I was able to follow most of it, I think, so great job. I wanted to ask like a clarification question for the meta-NERF. Is that basically like you have a library of data from other drones that have previously, say, scanned the environment, and now you're able to have kind of known models that help with your prediction? Is that what we're talking about?
So by meta-NERF, so there's a category of deep learning kind of research called meta-learning. And oftentimes what that's seeking to do is currently a single network will have a single task. So maybe it's like, how can a robot decide what action to take, or can you identify this specific cat in an image? More meta approach would be a kind of being able to generalize that. So basically make an application work across multiple environments, or be able to identify multiple like types of objects. So probably actually that the best way to describe it would be, pretend you had a network that could only identify cats. And a meta network that kind of like could be like one that learns to not just only identify cats, but also to identify other animals as well. And so in this case, right now, this NERF is storing the kind of shape and the color of a very specific type of object. So in that case, that office chair that was one of the objects, it's storing only kind of the information about that office chair. But there's other types of office chairs that look a little different. And so it'd be great if you could have a network that could kind of adjust to kind of be able to be like, okay, based on what I'm seeing, it's this specific object or type of office chair. And so when you use it to render, it renders the correct office chair.
Okay, and then does that rely on, I guess, data from prior experiments and other drones, or?
Yeah, so all these deep learn methods, the networks are going to be trained on a wide array of data. So like a lot of data. And so in this case, that meta NERF would be trained on a whole bunch of data on like with like different types of office chairs. And so basically, it would the network itself is a way to kind of capture all that data in a single network. And so then using though just hopefully a couple of images of my scene, that network would be able to kind of zero in on this specific object of interest.
Okay. And then I guess then going from there, because a lot of what you're focusing on is, speed and being able to kind of do it at the time of the operation of the drone, then would it be helpful to have, I guess, scouting drones that have better sensors and better gathering of information that can kind of populate that meta network so that once your drones go into there, it has, I guess, better data to work with to kind of learn from?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So say if you had kind of your main drone that's going to be doing this NERF VO, but ahead of time, it could get from some scouting drones, some images of the environment. It could then potentially use a GPU at a base station or something to kind of do this, kind of train this meta NERF into the specific instance of what it's going to see. So that would be one example of how that could work. But yeah, so it just is going to depend on how, like what exactly you're trying to do and what resources you have, but potentially yes.
Okay, thanks. Appreciate it.
Cool. I think we have time for one more question.
All right.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if I'm supposed to, but
Oh, yeah.
I don't know the procedure. So just how fast can you do the VO?
So right now the NERF VO, as I'm doing it, is very slow because I'm using the original NERF repo, which I think to train a NERF takes like 13 hours. And the forward pass is a lot faster than that, but generating all these images, like as the optimization is going on, takes a long time. However, work from, I want to say like maybe 2 months ago by NVIDIA was able to significantly speed up NERF. It's called NGP NERF or instant NERF. And so there's a lot of work right now looking at speeding up NERFs that would make it kind of much more able to be used in real-time applications. But my current implementation right now is definitely not real-time.
Thanks.
One more question.
One more question? Oh, yes.
Yeah, do you have any ideas about possibly extending the wireframe mapping to 3D?
Yes, that was something we talked about, never did, but it would be super useful. And I think, I did an internship at Facebook Reality Labs about a year ago. And one of the things that they were looking at doing was trying to, in a room, understand where all the flat surfaces were because they wanted to use that to like kind of project text onto. And like that immediately clicked in my mind. I'm like, well, representing if you can break the room down to be like roughly where are the flat areas, I could see that being really useful. I think you would have to make some changes to the specifics of what you're doing because like right now I take advantage of the 2D structure to be able to break up kind of like in order to actually do the specific steps of predicting the scan and updating the scan or the measurement or the map, sorry. But if you're able to kind of come up with 3D corollaries to each of those, you should be able to use the same overall framework.
Yeah, then thank you again for your great Thesis defense.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining.
With that, everyone is not on the committee has to
All right. Thank you, everyone. Or I guess, yeah. So Giovanni, at this point, if you can transition to the other Zoom link, I'll be on there shortly. And just thank you, everyone else who joined via Zoom. Sorry, I can't thank you all in person, but I will. Yeah, I appreciate you coming. Thank you.
See you. I'll open the other link.